Have you ever wondered if your personality is cut out for leadership? Have you ever compared yourself to the people that you think make phenomenal leaders and thought maybe you just don't have what it takes? You see, there's a lot of misconceptions around what personality means and what personality really means about you. So, in today's episode, we are unpacking 3 misconceptions around personality, how to figure out what your personality is, and how to optimize that for authentic leadership. Let's get right into it. Welcome to The Self-Led Leader, a podcast for high performers who want to lead from alignment, not expectation. I'm Dr. Christina Ady, a social psychologist, and I'm here to help you lead with clarity, not chaos. This show is about what happens before the strategy, your mindset, your nervous system, the inner leadership that shapes everything you say and do. Because presence isn't about being loud, it's about being aligned. Let's get right into it. Most people think that knowing your personality tends to box yourself in. That if you label yourself and your personality traits, you're categorizing yourself into what you can and what you can't do. But the truth is, your personality is not set in stone. It's a roadmap for how you prefer to act in certain situations. And it's sort of like a blueprint for how you actually prefer to lead, to handle situations, and to communicate with others. As a social psychologist, I spent over a decade studying personality and social interactions. And there's a lot of misconceptions that I see around personality, especially in pop psychology. And pop psychology is anything really that you read online that is simplified and popularized and often missing a lot of the core nuance that you need to understand yourself at a much deeper level. When I was a child, I did not know about the labels of introverted or extroverted. I just knew that I loved interacting with others. I loved having a big group of friends. I loved putting myself out there and being in situations where I was comfortable, even if there were a lot of people around. So that was often on sports teams like track, cross country, basketball, soccer, volleyball, anything of that nature in a team. I was there and I was flourishing. I had no problem speaking up in class. I had no problem sharing my opinions. It was just a normal part of who I was for me. It wasn't until I got older and I started to learn about common personality traits. I think it was around grade 11, around 16, where we had to start taking personality tests in school to give us an indication of what we should pursue and what types of careers we should look into. And if you can tell, I did not like that at all, which is funny considering I then went on to study this for over a decade. But the very first time I did a personality test at the age of 16, I was so thrown back by my results because they made no sense to me at all. I don't even recall what it was that I was recommended to do, and it just did not resonate at all. And the process of completing the personality test was so hard for me because multiple options were appealing, and it was hard to categorize myself into one specific label. And many people that I speak to have that experience. Maybe you've had that experience yourself. Part of the aversion and the resistance to defining yourself and what your personality is, because it feels like engraving it and setting it in stone and defining who you are across every single situation and circumstance. But again, that's just not true. So, before we get into the misconceptions around personality, let me first break down what the big personality traits are. Now, in psychology, there are 2 competing theories of personality. One is called the Big Five, or the Ocean Model, and it proposes that there are 5 big personality traits that everyone has. The second theory is the Big Six, or the HEXACO model, and this essentially is the first 5 personality traits with an addition of a 6th. And so for the purpose of today, I'm actually going to use the HEXACO model, the Big 6 personality traits, because I think the 6th trait actually gives a lot more depth and nuance to who you are, especially in a leadership role. Now, I've already alluded to this point, but personality is not set in stone, and whatever trait you think you fall on, please understand that there is a range. You are not either completely one or completely the other. For example, being extroverted versus introverted comes to mind, where people seem to categorize themselves as being completely extroverted or completely introverted, and they start to feel like it's one or the other, like they're mutually exclusive. And again, that's not the case. Every personality trait is a range. You can think of it as a scale going from 1 to 99. You may feel like certain situations bring out the 1, like it just doesn't exist, you don't have it at all. And other situations might bring you up to like a 25 or a 30. Okay? Think of it as a sliding scale, and think about each trait as something that you tend to gravitate towards one end of the scale or the other, but it does not mean that you can never go on the other side of the scale, or that certain situations, certain people, or certain social environments won't bring out the other side of you. So for example, if you're someone who thinks that you are very introverted, you may think of situations where you actually are what's considered extroverted, and maybe that's very specifically with a close group of friends or family that you're familiar with, or in environments that you are so completely comfortable with because you've been there 1,000 times, right? It is a range. And the reason I say it goes from 1 to 99 and not from 0 to 100 is because, again, it's not all or nothing. It's not that there's any trait that you are 0 on, like you completely lack it. That's not the case. And it's not that it goes to 100 that you are completely this thing. Again, it's not the case. I say it goes from 1 to 99 because there's always room for some of it, and there's always room to go up and down with it. So let's unpack the big 6 personality traits from the HEXACO model. Okay, so in the HEXACO model, the first is called honesty, humility. So someone on one end of the spectrum really values being sincere, honest, being modest, being fair in their choices. This is someone that would probably associate themselves as being humble, as not liking to brag about their success. Someone on the other end of the spectrum is someone that would describe themselves as perhaps being a little bit more willing to bend the rules, someone who cares about the status that they are at, especially the status that they are perceived as being at. They place a lot more emphasis and value on themselves, their wins, their successes, right? So it's a range, and you start to see the contrasting. On the one end, someone is perhaps overly modest, overly humble, overly attentive to how they are treating everyone because they value integrity over their image. They like to build trust through transparency. They like to avoid any form of manipulation. And on the other range of this trait, you see individuals who may be perceived as serving themselves, who see interactions as more transactional, more quid pro quo. If I do this, what can I get out of it, right? They are optimizing for the optics of what they like, perhaps a little bit more than the ethics of what they're doing. So every trait that we go through, again, there's no right or wrong. It's just if you were to rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 99, what would you rate yourself as? So the second trait is emotionality. And this is often in the big 5, this is what's often referred to as like neuroticism or being neurotic. So someone who's high on emotionality, someone who's on one range of it, they're seen as more sensitive, perhaps more anxious, more empathetic towards others, and emotionally attuned to others. So in a leadership role, these are the individuals who are more prone to create and to emphasize safe spaces, to pay attention to the emotional cues and the emotional patterns of others, including those in their teams, to notice subtle changes in the emotions of themselves and in those around them. On the other end of emotionality, you have someone who's perhaps more neutral or emotionally stable. They're less reactive. They are less likely to experience very high highs and very low lows. So this, in a leadership role, may be seen as someone who tends to be very, again, stable, very emotionally neutral. Maybe they are overlooking emotional dynamics. Maybe they unintentionally appear distant, detached, someone who's very stoic. So again, there's a range. Which one do you fall on? Are you someone who's more expressive, emotionally attuned, noticing the subtle changes in emotions? Or maybe you're someone who has the capability of feeling an emotional range that goes from 1 to 10. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's someone who's more stoic, who may experience emotions from, let's say, a 4 to a 6 or a 3 to a 7. They are perhaps not as emotionally reactive because they don't feel the emotions as deeply. And again, no right or wrong. It's just a range, and it's just an understanding of how different levels of personality traits bring out different qualities in people. And as a leader, it's important to understand what your qualities are, but also start to notice these nuanced personality differences in each of your team members as well. So the third personality trait is extroversion. And this is what I've already alluded to that many people are familiar with between extroversion and introversion. So high extroversion would be someone who's outgoing, they're energetic, they get a lot of their energy, or I don't want to say happiness, but they enjoy being around others. Being in groups, being in large settings, being around lots of people is totally fine for them, for their thought process, for their energy levels. They thrive in a group setting. They can be assertive. They could put themselves out there without thinking twice. On the opposite end of the spectrum, someone who would be considered more introverted would be someone who's more introspective. They are with their inner thoughts. They get drained in large settings or around lots of people. It feels exhausting and taxing on them, on their thought process, on their emotions. They would describe themselves as being more reserved, as preferring maybe deeper, thoughtful, more singular one-on-one interactions. When it comes to leadership, someone who's more extroverted is typically the stereotype of what a leader should be. These are the individuals who are, or who have been typically associated with characteristics like being visible, being outgoing, being charismatic, engaging, walking around and knowing everyone and saying good morning and how's it going to every single person they come across. Versus someone in a leadership role that's more introverted, well, they're more thoughtful. They're likely the ones who are very good at active listening and picking up on the nuance of conversations. Maybe they excel writing out very thoughtful reports or details, or taking the time to reflect on a situation and come back and talk about it at scale after the fact rather than in the moment. And again, the idea of leadership is changing. And as the world is changing, as companies are changing, as everything is sort of evolving, extroverted leaders are no longer just the go-to standard. And there's a lot of value in understanding who you are as a leader, where your natural strengths fall, and if you understand yourself and your trait and what you naturally tend to do, that's when you can lean into it and make it a strength, make it a superpower, if you will, rather than feeling like you're faulty and like you're lacking something that you should, when in reality, what you have may be perfectly perfect for what you need if you can learn to use it and optimize it to your advantage. Again, there's no right or wrong. It's about understanding where you fall and how you can use that for your leadership expression. Now, the fourth trait is agreeableness. And agreeableness is often thought of, based on the title, as being sort of passive or kind, but it's not quite it. So let's break it down. On one end of agreeableness, you have someone who really values being patient, being cooperative, being forgiving, so very harmonious in their relationships. As a leader, they like to have harmonious relationships. They're able to handle and diffuse conflict to be able to have cooperation. On the other end of the spectrum, you have individuals who are less patient for these sort of cooperative relationships. So they're more competitive. They're a little bit more skeptical of others. They're a little bit more blunt in their expression. So as leaders, these are the individuals who tend to set stronger boundaries, who may challenge ideas, who may be perceived as a little bit more combative or sometimes even a little bit more cold because they're not prioritizing collaboration as much. Now, the fifth trait is conscientiousness. And so someone on the higher end of conscientiousness, this is someone who's very organized. They're very disciplined. They're very careful and intentional. They're reliable. They're thorough. They're what you would say like as organized, strategic, and detail oriented, right? As a leader, there's someone who can see the strategy. They're focused in on the details. They can follow through. They can systematize and be very intentional with how they are processing and seeing things. On the other end of the spectrum, you have someone who's a little bit more spontaneous, flexible. Maybe they're a little bit more distracted or what would be seen as disorganized. They are a little bit more chaotic in a sense. They're open to interpretation and iteration. And because of this more fluid, flexible, spontaneous nature, maybe they do struggle a little bit more with deadlines or with consistency in being detail-oriented and need additional support with that. So again, as a leader, if you can identify where your strengths lie, you get to lean into those more. If you are recognizing that you're on the lower end of conscientiousness, if you're recognizing that systems are hard for you to implement, if you are feeling like you're coming up with 20 different ideas and you're distracted and it's hard to narrow down your focus, that's just the way that your mind works. And yes, you may need to work on that a little bit, but maybe you just put the right support in place so that someone external to you is helping you stay accountable and is helping you stay focused and is helping you be aware of the details you may overlook because you put that support in place for you so that you have room for flexibility while still putting measures in place to do what you need to do, right? Again, it's just all information about who you are and how certain environments bring out certain higher or lower levels of each of these traits that we all carry. Now, the sixth and final trait is openness to experience. And openness to experience on the higher end is someone who's just very curious. They're imaginative. They're literally what the name says. They're open to new experiences. They're creative. They like new things. So as a leader, this is someone who might be called a visionary. They're someone who gets ideas. They generate ideas. They focus on the future. They like ambiguity. It doesn't scare them when they don't know the answers. They thrive with innovation and ideas. But this can also be someone who tends to always want the shiny object syndrome of what's next? What else can I do? How can I push the boundaries? What else can be done, right? Depending on how high on the spectrum you go. Someone on the lower end of the spectrum, this is someone who's very practical, very conventional, very much thriving in stability, in routine, in things that are predictable. And so as a leader, this might be someone who really thrives in routines, in structure, in the same type of meeting, the same day of the week at the same time, with an agenda that everyone knows because they like the routine, they like the predictability, and they like the reliability that comes with that. As a result of that, though, if you're finding yourself on this range of the spectrum, just be mindful that you may likely resist change. You may likely resist new ideas. You may likely be aversive to trying to innovate because that's just your nature. And so it's important to identify, again, where are you on the spectrum and where are you as a leader? So again, just information. Go through, listen to this again a second time if you need to, so that you can really start to gauge, like, where are you on each of these traits as a range, right? From 1 to 99, how would you rate yourself? And what you'll likely find is if you start thinking about specific situations or specific environments, you'll find that the rating you give yourself likely changes. So maybe you're thinking of a boardroom and you'd give yourself like halfway. And then if you think about a team meeting, maybe that would fall, maybe that would rise, right? Like different environments naturally bring out different traits in you. And that is useful information to know because you can account for it, you can prepare for it, and you can adapt with it, right? That's the beauty of psychology and the beauty of understanding yourself. So let's now talk about the 3 most common misconceptions that I see and that I hear many of my clients talk about when it comes to their personality. And I've already alluded to 2 of these, but let's unpack them further. The first is this concept that who I am is set in stone, and that my personality is my personality is my personality is my personality forever. And that's just not the case, right? Who you are is a product of who you have been around, the environments that you have been in, and what you have been taught. This goes back to the nature versus nurture debate. Yes, nature plays a role. Yes, genetics play a role. Yes, how your family is will play a role. But so is what you've been taught. So is what you've been told is acceptable and what is not acceptable. Maybe you grew up in a family where everyone was very extroverted and everyone talked super loud and they had no problem talking over each other and they could talk for hours at family meetings. And maybe you felt like you never belonged. And as a result, maybe you were told that you had to change who you were in order to fit in based on the expectation that your family had of what you should be like. And all of us have had an experience like this. So your personality is not set in stone. Your personality is capable of change. Yes, like I've already talked about, different situations will bring out slightly different aspects of you. However, you have the capacity to completely change your personality if you wish to. Let's say you consider yourself to be an introvert, and maybe you think that in general, maybe if you were to rate yourself from 1 to 99, that you're about, 25. Maybe you've identified that certain situations can bring you down to a 15, and other situations bring you up to a 30 or a 35. That's not to say that your personality is set to being introverted, ranging from 15 to 30 for the rest of your life. You are able to change and to adapt and to become more extroverted if you wish to. And maybe over time, you can push that range from 25 or 30 all the way up to 60, right? Like your personality, it really is capable of change. But it does take time. And it does take some of that inner identity work to unpack that part of the reason why you feel like you are the way that you are is because of who you have been around, the environments that you have been in, and what you have been taught and told you should be like. Again, we've all had people tell us we should be a certain way. We've all had moments where we've been criticized for being who we are. Accepting that, working through it, changing through it, that's where real growth lies. But really, it starts with the foundational understanding that if you wish to be more or less of a certain trait, you absolutely can get there. The second misconception that I often hear is this idea of there being a certain type of personality that is optimized for leadership. And often that is associated with being very extroverted as like the main one. And again, there is no ideal leadership personality. Yes, there are characteristics that help. Yes, there are characteristics and traits that help you become a better leader. But that's not to say that being in a certain range is not optimal. Because again, the key is to really understand how you are wired to be right now and to understand how that impacts your role, how you're showing up, and how you are thinking about your job and your management of other individuals. Like if you are someone who's lower on agreeableness and you find yourself being very blunt, a little bit too cold or a little bit too combative or a little bit too stoic in meetings, like yes, maybe that's something that you identify is not ideal for the type of leadership role you'd like for yourself, for the type of reputation, for the type of role model that you would like to have. But that's not to say that you're not capable of changing, and that's not to say that it doesn't work. Like think through some of the top leaders that you look up to. Think of some of the top companies. Yes, there are personality traits that tend to be common, but there are a ton of differences between every individual as well. So understand where you are starting from. Understand where you are now. And then get really clear and honest where you would like to be instead if there is something that you feel like needs to be changed or optimized. Now, the third misconception is feeling like personality is almost like pop psychology. Like it's talked about way too much. It's oversimplified, that It's just putting people in boxes, and that in reality, there's way too many differences to talk about. And I get that, and I hear you. And I have had times in my life where I have felt that way as well. However, in reality, when it comes to, for example, personality research, there's a reason why it's called the Big Six, or there's a reason why it's the Big Five in personality theory. And that's because they have taken a ton of different traits, different, if you were to think of like adjectives to describe someone's personality, you can talk about something like outgoing, charismatic, confident, personable, chatterbox, right? Like you can take hundreds of different adjectives. And this is what they've done in personality research. They've taken hundreds of these adjectives that we use to describe people in these nuanced ways. And they have looked for the commonalities and the similarities. And they have grouped them very strategically into the Big Five and the Big Six traits on these ranges. So even though it sounds like personality has been oversimplified and broken down into 6 personality traits, in reality, these 6 traits are on a spectrum that encompasses 12 different traits, right? The high is one version, the low is a completely different version that would be seen as a completely different personality trait. And these 12 sort of overarching traits are accounting for hundreds of other descriptions that fall into them, generally speaking. So although I can totally understand how this seems like an oversimplified pop psychology sort of fun little game to put yourself into little boxes, in reality, yes, psychology is convoluted. Yes, psychology and your mind is beautiful, and there's a lot going on, and there's so much nuance. But yes, there is so much truth in being able to understand your core traits and how you fall on that spectrum. Because it's not about boxing yourself into labels. It's not about restricting yourself to be a specific type of person that aligns with what you think you should be based on the labels that you've checked off that you fit into. It's about understanding who you are to create freedom in being a version of you that is optimized for how you prefer to function, rather than feeling like you need to perform a version of you based on what you've been told about your personality. If you've ever taken a personality test and it felt hard, that's because you fall on a range that may be a little bit closer to the middle. You may not be a cookie cutter trait kind of person, and that is totally fine. But you are only boxing yourself in if you box yourself in. Me talking about the traits, me giving you ideas of the range, that's not boxing you in. It's your decision to then decide and to be very real, raw, and honest with yourself about what you are actually like and what you're going to do with that information moving forward. So think of this as a way to assess where you are, to give yourself the self-knowledge to create the freedom that you desire in your ability to optimize yourself and your workflow, rather than a limitation on who you are capable of being. So again, leadership is not defined to one specific persona. When you begin to understand your natural patterns, you stop feeling like you're performing as a leader. You stop feeling fake and like you're just performing for other people. And you start to really optimize who you are and how you are leading and how you are showing up for a way that is optimized for you, your natural preferences, and the way that you want to be seen as work. Yes, you can copy what has worked for other people's. Yes, you can look at other role models and look at the personality traits that you think you need, but you can also start to anchor that into who you actually are and the version of that that naturally comes out with your unique combination of personality. So for example, you can look at a role model in business, maybe someone like an Alex Hormozi or Layla Hormozi, big fan of them, and you can look at their personality and assume that that's what you need. Or you can start to dissect their personality on these spectrums and start to optimize, where do you fall, where would you like to fall instead, and where are you sort of optimizing instinctually to be a better leader versus what are you just overcorrecting to try to fit a mold that you have created in your mind of what you think other people want you to be like. So ask yourself this. What are some of your traits that are actually strengths that you can lean into more fully now? And what are the traits that you might need to optimize to have a little bit of support to make sure they're helping you and not harming you? So listen back, listen to the explanation of the Big Six again if you need to, so that they can really sink in and resonate with where you fall on the spectrum. Remember, think of it as a scale of 1 to 99 and not a scale of 0 to 100, because everyone falls somewhere on each of the ranges. If you want to dive deeper into your leadership presence, I have a free executive presence resource that can be really helpful for you to combine the two. Once you begin to understand where your personality starts to fall, you can go through my free executive presence PDF and start to really dissect what areas of your executive presence are really up to par with your standards and where you might have some blind spots and some things that you're overlooking. There's also a ton of suggestions in there for how you begin to customize a roadmap for you so that you can get your executive presence to where you want it to go. To take a look at that, go to christina80.com/worksheet, and I'll also link it in the description for you. Once again, that's christina80.com/worksheet. If you have any other questions, if you have some insights to share from this episode, I'd love to hear them. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn, on YouTube, on Instagram, as well as through my website, christina80.com. I hope you found this useful. I can't wait to hear about your breakthroughs, and I'll talk to you in the next episode. Take care.